Hello everyone. Since the past few days, we have been hearing a lot about the ceasefire deal between Israel and Palestine. Now we hear the debates about how long lasting this would be and the like. From the start of the conflict on the 7th of October 2023 until January 2025, it has been 15 months now. And we have heard a lot of back and forth whether the ceasefire deal is happening, not happening, and now finally, seemingly, it has been agreed upon. Notwithstanding how fragile it is, no deal or deal, one thing is certain that in these last 15 months, we have learned the importance of a deal. We have learned once again the importance of diplomacy. Hence, today we are going to talk about how to negotiate. We are going to look at a remarkable statesman and diplomat of the Renaissance Italy and consult him regarding the matters of diplomacy. I am talking about none other than Francesco Guicciardini. As we can see recently, the importance of diplomacy seems to have suddenly surged, though its importance was always there. The two major conflicts that mar the world currently are the Russian-Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Palestine war. Apart from these conflicts that have obsessed the world leaders, there are also other conflicts like the one in Sudan that has been affecting millions in that country. Whenever there is a need of resolution in a conflict, we start to hear the word deal, ambassadors, foreign affairs and accords as the only means to stop it. All of these terms and many others come under the ambit of diplomacy. But what is interesting is that since our minds are shaped by the mass media, diplomacy appears and disappears at the whim of the moment, as if diplomacy just comes alive at the time of crisis, which is obviously never the case. What we often forget is that what we understand by international relations is nothing but the sum of diplomatic relations. Today we are going to look at some advice regarding what ambassadors really should do at the time of negotiation, and especially during war. Recently, we heard in news about the 100 years agreement between the UK and the Ukraine as if it is one of a kind. I'm talking in terms of its length. Have you forgotten about the Sykes-Picot agreement? Have you forgotten about the Balfour Declaration? Have you forgotten about the Oslo and Abraham Accords? We listen to these agreements and forget about them as soon as we listen about them, as if their effect has died out in a day. And that is the problem. We need to keep a close eye on the developments after the agreement throughout the year so that we can understand better what is going on behind the scene. Or to put it more aptly, what is actually going on in the world. Because most of the conflicts are the results of these agreements. Human history is mostly a sequence of reactions of the agreements by diplomats. The point of this short introduction is to underscore the importance of diplomacy in human history in general, and also how much each one of our lives are related to them. What is NATO after all? It is a military alliance. In short, an agreement between a number of countries on a certain set of conditions. Now imagine a world where it does not exist, as has been often projected by Donald Trump's stance throughout recent years, some would suggest. Then each country under this alliance would have to really revamp their own military and to think about new military alliances and so on and so on. So, in short, diplomacy is at the heart of how our world spins. We need to take it seriously. So let's take it seriously. We will look at one of the ambassadors of the Renaissance Italy to understand how these distinguished people in whose hands rest the fate of so many countries and consequently the world go around doing their business. What do they think? And most importantly, what should they think and do? We are going to look at the Ricordi of Guicciardini today. But before going on to the book, it would be worth it to have a glance at his personality and works. Francesco Guicciardini was born into a wealthy, affluent family in 1483 in Florence. His family was politically prominent and had access to the political echelons of their times going back decades. The first name that comes to our mind when we think about the politics of Renaissance Italy is the Medici family, and rightly so, because they have left an indelible influence on the course of Italian history. Another name that comes to our mind immediately with Medici related to this era is Machiavelli. Surprise, surprise, Guicciardini knew both of them really well. Usually when the scholars talk about Guicciardini, they talk about him as a historian. That because he wrote a remarkable history of his times entitled Storia d'Italia. But that was just one of his many contributions to the Italian literature. He also wrote political books during his life. Amongst them, the most important one is his commentaries on Machiavelli, in which he criticizes Machiavelli's reading of the Roman history. In fact, he also criticizes in general the role of the interpretation of history. Other notable works include Florentine history and Ricordi. Now, what is interesting about this last mentioned one, Ricordi, is that it was published posthumously. I mean, that is not an interesting fact that it was published posthumously, but that why was it published posthumously? It is because Guicciardini actually kept a kind of journal throughout his life and had correspondence with his close family and friends, which also included Machiavelli. This journal and his letters were meant to be a kind of guide for his close ones, like pearls of wisdom that he had gathered throughout his experience as diplomat and governor. And then finally it was published after his life. A word about his career in politics so that we can have more justification about the wisdom of the words that we will shortly encounter. He was diplomat, governor of various provinces at different times, Commissioner General of the Papal Army. He worked under Lorenzo de' Medici and then under Pope Leo X. So he had seen the most of the inside of the courts of the most powerful men of his time firsthand. In brief, he was directly involved in most of the political events of his time, and his Ricordi is a well thought out summary of his political career. A must read for any diplomat and generally for politicians and especially for us readers who just want to understand the world. Ricordi is published in aphoristic style, pretty much like diary entries. When Guicciardini had something to note, he just scribbled it down in it. It was not meant to be published for the general public. The most he would have thought it would reach would be the hands of his friends, as already mentioned. The first part of it was written from 1512 to 1521 when he was politically active in Modena and Romagna. The second part that starts after the 107th entry was written when he was governor of Siena from 1521 to 1527. And thankfully we have it in our hands now. There are many books nowadays that deal with these kinds of topics, how to negotiate, how to win an argument, how to do this, how to do that. But what is interesting is to note that strangely never do we see Guicciardini mentioned in these books. So let's get to it and see what does he have to offer in this regard. He begins with the subject of faith in his very first reflection. He commences with these words. Quote open. What the devout tell us of him that hath faith, accomplishing great things, and in the words of scripture removing mountains, rests upon this, that faith breeds obstinacy. For faith is no more than to believe firmly and almost with certainty things not in themselves reasonable, or if reasonable, to believe them more implicitly than reason warrants. He therefore that has faith becomes stubborn in his belief, and goes on his way resolute and intrepid, contemning difficulties and dangers, and ready to suffer every extremity. Whence it happens that as the things of this world are subject to infinite changes and chances, in the course of events unlooked for help may come in many ways to him who hath obstinately persevered, which perseverance being the result of faith. It may well be said that whoso hath faith will accomplish great things, whereof we have at the present hour signal instance in the stubbornness of the Florentines, who, having contrary to all human reason, set themselves to await the joint attack of Pope and Emperor, without hope of aid from others, disunited among themselves, and encompassed by difficulties on every side, have for 7 months withstood behind their walls the assaults of army against whom it seemed impossible they could hold out for as many days. Nay, have brought things to such a point that whereas at first all deemed them lost, were they now to conquer, none would be surprised. And this stubbornness of theirs is mainly due to the belief that, as Friar Girolamo Ferrara told them in his sermons, they cannot be destroyed. Quote close. In the Renaissance Italy, while the intellectuals on the one hand were engrossing with the classics, after all, we get the word Renaissance, which means rebirth in French, from this unprecedented intellectual attention towards the classics of ancient Greece and Rome. On the other hand, there was this skepticism amongst the religious fanatics regarding this intellectual invasion of paganism in the pure Christian way of life. Just when Michelangelo was achieving his magnificent feat in the domain of arts, Da Vinci was painting his Mona Lisa, and Raphael creating his masterpieces, in the same way, Machiavelli and Guicciardini were struggling with the questions of political renaissance and creating masterpieces like Il Principe and Storia d'Italia. It was an age where reason was showing itself as powerfully as faith. But as we can see even today, if there exists in a society both faith and reason with full force, that society can never stay in peace. These two forces are always considered as contrary to each other. Though Kierkegaard would come in the 19th century to try and negotiate a peace treaty between them, Kierkegaard said that faith is immediacy after reflection. Now contrast it with what Guicciardini mentions here. Faith breeds obstinacy. Whereas Kierkegaard tries to address the correct origin of faith and define it as briefly as he could, Guicciardini, on the other hand, is a practical man. He is concerned more about the manifestation of faith in society, in the intellectual salon, and most importantly, in the streets. What faith does to a being is remarkable. With reason or without reason, it makes the person believe in a set of principles and breeds stubbornness, blind obstinacy, and complete indifference to anything that may challenge his or her beliefs. Now we should remember Guicciardini is not writing a theological treatise here that deals with the rationality and theology of faith and religious authority. He is more concerned about the fact that how does faith affect politics on the street. And of all the people, Guicciardini could have had at least one personality in mind while talking about absurd faith and its political effect on the public, i.e. Girolamo Savonarola. To illustrate this, he gives an example of his beloved Florence. In order to understand the instance that he mentions in his aphorism, we need to visit one of the most important and interesting era in the Italian history, the 1490s. So what was happening in Florence at that time? In 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died. With Lorenzo the Magnificent, almost all historians say the Medici family died. That is to say, its long stretch of rule over Italy came to an end. It was a monopolistic rule. But not immediately, because right after Lorenzo, his son Piero de' Medici took up the charge of this family and the city-states under the Medici rule. But he would not be able to rule for more than 2 years, because King Charles VIII of France was waiting for the opportunity to rule the wonderful city-state of Florence. And as Guicciardini explains, there were not only foreign threats to Florence, but within it there were many factions like the Pazzi family who had already hatched a conspiracy against the Medicis. But anyways, we need not remember how many families there were in Florence. What we do need to remember is that a foreign force, France, was waiting to attack Florence because the other foreign force, Spain, was also keeping an eye on the decline of the Medicis, and Florence itself had internal divisions. It all exploded in 1494, when for the first time Florence got the chance to finally apply the ideal political principles that were until then the heritage of libraries. That is to say, now the Medici is out of power, the French invasion allowed the Florentines to revamp their political structure and begin anew. Now comes Guicciardini's apprehension concerning blind faith stepping into politics. After the fall of the Medici, Savonarola became a de facto ruler of Florence. He had already made his name in Florence with his moving sermons from the pulpit of the churches since 1482. Most of his sermons were directed against the corruption in the church, with main target being Pope. He just did not believe strongly in the corruption of the religious people. He was equally critical of the liberal society. After having attained the coveted seat of the ruler of Florence, his impetus to morally and religiously rectify Florence reached its zenith in 1497 when he led the citizens to the notorious bonfire of vanities in 1497, where he encouraged the burning of objects considered sinful, such as books, art, and luxury items. Pope had had enough of him in 1498. He excommunicated him, arrested him, and put him to death. With Savonarola out of scene, the Florentines debated strongly amongst themselves how not to make the same mistake and further improve their democratic institution. In 1502, finally it was decided after a relentless tug of war between different factions that a reputable man in everyone's eyes named Piero Soderini will serve as Gonfaloniere for life, which in our terms today would be Prime Minister for life, vaguely speaking. So when all seemed settled, the elites of Florence were gradually becoming unhappy about the political concessions they had to go through in the name of democracy. The internal factions increased in Florence, while the Medici family was tagging the Spanish and the papacy to reclaim their beloved city-state back from whom? From the Florentines. In 1512, they were finally successful in re-establishing themselves in Florence. But their power and influence was now dependent upon foreign forces and not on their own merit. When Guicciardini mentions the obstinacy of Florentine faith, he is referring to the years close to 1512. History is a mere collection of facts at times. But if you want to infuse life into it, you need to keep books like Ricordi handy to learn lessons from history. There is one drawback of this obstinate behavior that comes with blind faith: the stubbornness to not negotiate. We can see this in modern conflicts also. Behind every war, there is a clash of beliefs. It may be political, religious, or social. If both parties decide to stay obstinate in their beliefs and not allow for any compensation or modification of their positions, then there would never be any negotiation possible. The guns will keep on blazing, the missiles will keep on dropping, and the innocents will keep on dying. There would be only prolongation of suffering without any end, because the only other way to stop the war is to either completely erase the existence of the enemy from the earth with its ideologies and belief systems, which is impossible. That is why it is indispensable that there are negotiations at some point. Faith, as explained earlier, is one of the underlying causes of this prolongation. If the messianic thugs sitting on top of political ladder just keep on repeating their mantra of faith. In one of his aphorisms, Guicciardini explains this conclusively. Quote open. He that is in too great haste to bring a war to a conclusion will often prolong it. For the failure to await the necessary supplies and the fitting season for the enterprise makes that difficult which otherwise had been easy. And thus for every single day it was thought to gain by dispatch. More than a month is frequently lost, not to mention that this may be the cause of further disaster. Quote close. It means that on the table of negotiation all the parties must sit with reason as its guide, not faith. Because faith is non-negotiable. After having discussed this religious fanaticism, Guicciardini immediately comes to the reflection regarding the messengers of king, or ambassadors as we call them. He writes, quote open, in sending forth ambassadors to treat with foreign courts, certain princes will freely make known to them their secret mind and the ends their negotiation are meant to serve. Others, again, judge it better only to impart what they would have the foreign prince persuaded of, thinking they can hardly deceive him unless they first deceive the ambassador who is to be the instrument and agent for treating with him. Quote close. So the first thing he mentions is the treatment of the ambassadors at home. Princes and kings, just like prime ministers and presidents, are humans. They have a certain set of beliefs, a perspective according to which they judge humans. Some think that it is better not to impart everything to the ambassador, or do not consider certain things of high importance to be told to the ambassador. And then there are others who trust easily. In the case of oligarchies or distribution of foreign ministries amongst the family, we can see that it is very difficult to keep secret and not pass on the whole information to the ambassador. Well, Guicciardini then gives his opinion about both of these perspectives. He continues, quote open, something is to be said in favor of both these methods. For on the one hand, the ambassador who knows that his own prince is seeking to deceive the other can scarcely be expected to speak or act with the same boldness, firmness, or efficacy he would use if he believed the negotiations to be meant honestly and in good faith. Nay, unless he so believes, he may readily, whether from spite or levity, let his master's designs be seen through, which he could not do were he ignorant of them. On the other hand, when the negotiations are only feigned, the ambassador who thinks them seriously meant will often go further than the necessity of the case requires, and imagining his prince to be really anxious to gain a certain end, will act with less wariness and circumspection in the conduct of the affair than he would have used had he been informed of its true bearing. And since it is well nigh impossible to give an ambassador such precise instructions as will guide him in every emergency, it must be left to his discretion to show him how he may best forward the general object of his mission. But he who has not full knowledge of its nature cannot do this, and in consequence may fall into numberless mistakes. Quote close. Before going on to even reflect about the consequences of both methods, it would be worthwhile to take a pause and consider for a second how he is portraying the state of affairs at the level where the fortunes of millions of citizens are decided. Everyone, mind you, everyone from the king to the lowly being is a human. We have the habit of looking at our political leaders with a pinch of doubt, as if they possess some superhuman qualities and have more talent and knowledge to deal with the principles of the state. But as Guicciardini clarifies, with first-hand experience, these people may have access to more information with the help of the state institutions specifically designed to collect intelligence abroad and internally. But these people are as humans as you and me. They're as prone to human follies as you and me. In the case of anxiety shown from the leader to his ambassador, it is equally likely that the ambassador himself does not believe in a word of what has been spoken to him, because he senses that the intentions are diluted with malice. And as we can judge, this affects the way the ambassador would speak and negotiate with the foreigners. In the same way, if too much confidence is given to the ambassador, it is equally likely that he is the wolf of the pack and may prefer his own interest over that of state. As we see often happens, the information leakage is mostly done by the insider, barely by an outsider. Guicciardini concludes this reflection by giving his opinion in this matter. He continues, quote open, my own opinion is that the prince who has discreet and honest ambassadors, and such as are well affected towards him, and so well cared for by him that they have no motive to look elsewhere, will do better to open his mind to them fully. But that unless sure of their being of this sort, his safest plan is not to take them altogether into his confidence, but let the impressions he conveys to them be the ground they are to go on in persuading the foreign prince. Quote close. In order to make the negotiation successful where the king is himself not involved, it is of tantamount importance who he chooses to represent himself. The choice of the ambassador going to the foreign court matters the most in this regard. We are going to talk about this in more detail later. This is the reason why everyone keeps an eye out on the political career of the people selected for foreign missions. Posts like foreign ministers, ambassadors, councils are not to be taken lightly. They are the face of the country, the one who talks on behalf of the nation. On his or her words hang the fate of his national citizens. Guicciardini sifts through his experience as ambassador in Spain and gives the following observation regarding the King of Spain. Quote open. When ambassador in Spain, I observed that whenever the Catholic King Don Ferdinand of Aragon, a most prudent and powerful prince, was minded to engage in any new enterprise, he would so contrive matters that before his intention was published, the whole court and people were crying out and urging upon him that this was a thing he ought to do. The king disclosing his design at the moment it was thus desired and called for. It was received by his subjects and throughout his dominions with incredible support and favor. Quote close. As he had highlighted earlier, and now he confirmed it with his own experience, that the best way to conduct negotiations is to surround oneself with a group of people who trust you completely and can see through your intentions easily. Before one goes around convincing the others, one should first be able to convince those around him. And this underlines another important characteristic of a successful negotiator. He has to be honest in character, or at least seems to be honest in character. Guicciardini almost looks surprised at the behavior of the Spanish king and those around him. He had seen the tragedy and bonfires in Florence. He could not digest the fact that there exist kings in whose courts character rules more than words. This is again a word of advice to the politicians, that if only words counted, then there would not have been so many wars throughout human history. When we are trying to understand what the other person wants to say, we are more concerned with his intentions than his words. Intentions matter more than words, and intentions are nothing but an extension of personality. Take as an example a politician who has always said that the ceasefire deal is close by, but at the same time spend billions in helping to fuel the war. Who would doubt what is the real intention of this person? Therefore, for a successful negotiation, we need to gain credibility of our words, and most of all, moral credibility. For what cause are the negotiations taking place? And this can only be attained if the character of the negotiator is worthy of emulation. If the character of the negotiator is itself questionable, then he would have lost the negotiation even before a word is said. Guicciardini now turns to the other side of the coin and gives the ambassador's perspective. And he stresses upon the importance of this reflection as he exclaims, quote open. It is seen that ambassadors often take the part of the prince to whose court they are sent, and this makes them be suspected either of having received bribes or of looking for them, or at least of having been won over by the civilities and attentions paid them. Yet, it may also be that having the affairs of the prince with whom they are living constantly before their eyes, and their attention less drawn to any other, they seem to them of more than their true importance. But as this reason does not operate with the prince who sends them, by whom all the circumstances needing to be considered are equally known, he speedily sees his minister to be at fault, and often ascribes to dishonesty what in truth results from want of judgment. Let him who goes as an ambassador, I note this well, for it is a matter of much importance. Quote close. If a certain ambassador is sent abroad and stays abroad with the king for a while, then he is walking on thin ice. Guicciardini is here giving the critical nature in which the ambassador finds himself or herself all the time. The foreigner thinks the received ambassador is over-attached and may have some information to collect and report back, while his own prince doubts the true intentions of stay. In other words, the ambassador is always a suspect. At least that's the idea we get with reading Guicciardini's words. And why would he not be? Let alone negotiating a ceasefire. On a personal level, if you cannot negotiate a business deal personally with someone and sends a representative on your behalf to do it, then the complicated process in terms of negotiation would surely take a turn that would not correspond to your liking. It is in human nature to doubt anything that is not according to prejudgments and preconceptions. Even if a stone has budged a bit from its place and you have forgotten that you struck it by chance, you will always doubt someone else to have replaced it. Anything that is not how we want it to be arises doubt in our minds. This is why ambassadors have a difficult job at their hands to gain the trust of both parties and be true to the interests of his own state. Because he is working for a king who has the power to take his head off his body. Apart from this inbuilt skepticism in human nature, the ambassador's job is further complicated by the nature of his job. We have already talked about the ambassador as a representative of the state or the king. Let's confirm it with the wise words of the king as Guicciardini reports them here. Quote open. It was a saying of Duke Lodovico Sforza that princes and crossbows were to be tried by the same test. Whether a crossbow were a good one or no could be known by the bolts it carried. And the worth of a prince was seen in the men he sent to represent him abroad. We may accordingly infer what kind of a government we have in Florence when at one and the same moment we see employed as our ambassadors Carducci in France, Gualterotto in Venice, Messer Bardi in Siena, and Messer Galeotto Gioini in Ferrara. Quote close. An ambassador or a negotiator is a symbol of the worth of the person who sent him. The choice of the ambassador in itself betrays the intention in which direction does the king want to take the negotiation. And that is not it. It also betrays the worth of the king's mind. We can equally apply this principle in our world more comfortably to understand what is going on around the world more so than the citizens living in the Renaissance Italy. They did not have internet or even information of who is visiting whom as much as we do. If you want to figure out the intellectual, moral, and social worth of a country, or at least its attitude towards our country, we can get the idea by looking at the ambassador of that country sent to live with us. And when the matter is as grave as it became in 1944 between England and Soviet Russia towards the end of the Second World War about the question of Greece, then who represented England? Which ambassador did Churchill send to Moscow? He went himself. When it is the matter of life and death, the prime ministers go to the negotiating table themselves. Churchill presented the quote-unquote percentages agreement himself. He proposed that let us keep 90% of the influence of Greece and Stalin can have 10%. So in negotiations, it matters a lot who is sitting in front of you on the table. In the constant back and forth between the ceasefire deal between Israel and Palestine, there have been many actors. But if we want to know the intentions of each of the party and their hardiness, then we need just consult the list of negotiators sent from each side to strike it in the end. While we are at war, I mean literally we are going through war times, then why not spend some more time with Guicciardini and see what he has to say about war? Since he is a practical man and has seen many wars during his life, he knows the core of the problem in war, which is the first thing he mentioned in his reflections on war, i.e. money. What is interesting to note at this point is that there is no mention of war in the first part of the Ricordi. The mention of war begins in its second part. While he was writing the second part, the Medicis had installed themselves back and it had been some time since their reinstallation. Not just that, since they were dependent upon the Spanish and papal support, it meant that they were stuck in the web of conflicts that were not their own. You gain something only if you are also ready to pay the cost. And when Guicciardini reflects upon the war, he also talks about the financial side of the war, not the media propaganda of who is winning or losing. He is not so much concerned at this moment about that, but what he is really concerned with is said in these words. Quote open. In wars, whoso would be sparing will spend most, since there is nothing that demands a larger or more unstinted outlay. The more complete your preparations are, the sooner will the war be over. And as the failure to spend money prolongs the enterprise, the cost in the end is out of all comparison greater. Accordingly, there is nothing more ruinous than to enter on a campaign when you are without ready money and have to pay by drafts at long dates. For in this way, you rather feed the war than finish it. Quote close. There is something called the war of attrition, in which the main idea is that one should exhaust the enemy by prolonging the war as much as possible and laying siege to the territory so that one day the enemy will itself run out of resources and lay down the weapons. This kind of war was started by Pericles against Sparta and was one of the common devices employed by the USA in the diplomatic outlook towards the Soviet Union until its demise. And it worked, because as we know, the Soviet Union was defeated or fell without a fire shot. At least that is the common view. But anyways, coming back to Guicciardini's words, in this kind of prolonged war, the person who loses the most is the one who spent the most to sustain during the war. For this, one needs preparation, financially and militarily both. In a surprise attack, this cannot be done, which is why it is recommended to end the war quickly if there was a surprise attack, because you were ill prepared. If the war continues for long, then the enemy may be decimated, but its will to fight will be fortified, and the real loser will be the one who is prolonging the war. As Guicciardini explains it, in the case of the war of attrition, mostly the war is fueled. More actors come in, the increase in inflation leads to higher costs, and ultimately the war is further fueled rather than appeased. But Signore Guicciardini, you are a diplomat. Would you enlighten us something about the treaties and the role of the country diplomatically in times of war? Why wouldn't he? This is what he says regarding the treaties amongst countries, especially those treaties that grant the state neutrality in war. He reflects and scribbles. Quote open. Whosoever is not well secured by treaty or by being himself so strong that in no case can he have ground for fear, acts unwisely if he stands neutral in the wars of other states. Since in doing so he will disoblige the vanquished and will rest a prey to the victor. And let him who disregards reason look to the example of our own city, and to what befell it from remaining neutral in the war which Pope Julius and the Catholic king waged against the King Louis of France. Quote close. The international system has always been and is now more so a web of interlinked treaties that leaves no other option for a state but to have some kind of relationship with the world at large. That is to say, if a country decides to stay apart from the game of power struggle always going on either on a regional or on an international level, or more aptly put, stay neutral, then it will always lose. Furthermore, it matters a lot how a certain country positions itself during war, even if that war does not seem to directly concern itself. Why? Because of two reasons. Firstly, because it betrays the moral stance of the country, and secondly, as Guicciardini explains, it would face the wrath of the victor that it did not endorse the victory, and equally it would face the wrath of the loser that it did not even come to support its moral cause. We all make fun of the UN. What is its use when there is a veto vote in the Security Council and whatnot? But everyone in the world sees who has vetoed and why. The UN may be useless in action, but it does betray clearly the level of barbarity and corruption all around the world, which also includes itself at the highest level of international politics. If for nothing else, then perhaps the UN would be remembered for unveiling, even uselessly, the moral or political causes of conflicts and who was on whose side. Whenever there is a vote in the General Assembly, there is an option of yes, no, or abstain. In the previous few years, we have seen the politicization of abstention. Because those countries who abstain, in other words, those who do not want to betray their intentions, are afraid of saying yes. That is pretty much it. In war, there is either good or evil. There is no such thing as I do not know, according to Guicciardini. In the next reflection, he turns again to the subject of prolonged war, and this time round he gives the perspective of the besieged. He says, quote open, things fated to perish not by violence but by a gradual wasting often hold out much longer than at first seemed possible. Not merely because their decay is slower than was counted on, but also because men, if stubborn to endure, will do and suffer things beyond belief. Accordingly, we find that a war which has to be brought to an end by famine, failure of ammunition, want of money, or the like, always lasts much longer than was expected. In like manner, the life of the hectic patient is constantly prolonged beyond the time anticipated by the physicians and those about him. So too, the merchant who is eaten up by usury will keep his feet for an inconceivable time before he breaks. Quote close. Well, there is no such thing as a planning of the length of war. Nobody can do that, unless you are a Bismarck. He famously said in 1870 regarding the Franco-Prussian War that it would be over in 6 weeks, with or without the help of God. And it took 7 weeks in total to end the war. Well, we can give him an extra week. But he succeeded because, as Guicciardini underscores, he did not opt for a war of attrition. He opted for a swift war with a particular set of objectives that did not have genocide or famine or siege as an option. Therefore, the beginning of war is the most important moment for any nation. It is important to note what are the objectives professed by the political leaders and how he or she thinks they can be achieved. The more the enemy is allowed to suffer, the more it is hardened, the more it becomes used to suffering. Like Camus said, if we suffer too much, we become used to suffering. Then suffering becomes the status quo, and the endurance keeps on increasing as the difficulties increase. Diplomacy is too vast a subject to be covered in such a short time span. It has many nuances, but unfortunately, it is not as popular as it must be so that we can understand the true motivations of the actors of the international stage. It is not just that we need to study the theory of international relations. In fact, even if we do that, as Kenneth Waltz said, the most important subject for a diplomat or a student of international relations is history. I bid you adieu with a maxim of Guicciardini that is equally beneficial for a historian and for a student of history. We need to spend more time reading what has happened than what will happen, because history rhymes. And we are seeing the worst crimes against humanity written on history pages right in front of our eyes. Guicciardini highlights the importance of true history thus. Quote open. All historians, without, as it seems to me, a single exception, are at fault in omitting to relate many things known in their times as being matters of universal notoriety. Whence it happens that in the histories of the Greeks, the Romans, and all other nations, we are at the present day in the dark concerning many matters of fact. For instance, as to the authority and distinction of their magistrates, their systems of government, their methods of warfare, the size of their towns, and many like matters, which being very well known at the date they wrote, they in consequence passed over. But had they reflected that in the course of time cities disappear and the memory of things is lost, and that histories are written for no other reason than that these may be perpetuated, they would have been more careful to write in such a way that men born in a distant age should have every event as much before their eyes as those in whose presence they happened. For this is the true object of history. Quote close. Thank you, everyone.